Hi, my name's Joanna Barratt and I'm here to read another chapter from my book, Lessons from Life. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount. We're up to Matthew chapter 6 verses 25 and 26 where Jesus says, take no thought for your life, what you eat, what you drink, what you put on. And this particular message is concerning take no thought for clothes. Choice of clothes is of vital importance to millions of people in Western society because clothes are associated with image. What we wear has become a statement about who we are. Buy the clothes and you buy the image, whether cool and trendy, elegant and sophisticated, or dignified and official. What drives this massive multi-billion-pound industry? Why will people swap one perfectly good set of clothes for another set in a few months' time just to keep in fashion? Well, the answer is covetousness. Mammon, love of money, covetousness rules the world. But Jesus says we can't serve God and mammon. We can't have both kingdom thinking and the world's thinking. Paul says, don't be conformed to this world. James says, don't you know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? The whole attitude, disposition and mindset of the world is totally at odds with God's way. Covetousness, image and fashion, they're all mindsets. We've been conditioned by the world to believe that material things will bring contentment. But godliness with contentment is great gain. Get your eyes off material prosperity and onto Jesus and his kingdom. The race is not over yet. It must have been wonderful to live during the time when Jesus walked the earth. Decision making must have been so simple compared to today. I don't recall anywhere in the Bible where it talks about people getting undressed for bed and slipping into their pyjamas or nightwear. They must have worn the same thing day in and day out, only changing garments when they were filthy and needed to be washed. Boring? Yeah, but what a fuss-free lifestyle. I must be one of those very fortunate ones because my parents couldn't afford to kit me out in designer clothes as a tot, so I never really worried about what I wore. My clothes used to come from either neighbours or jumble sales. I was about 9 years old, but I can vividly remember the first time my younger sister and I were taken to a store to get something brand new. We both got a pink, they used to call them duster coats then, and they cost £2 each from a fire salvage store. Then Mum set to work making dresses for us from an old pair of floral curtains. And together with our little pink coats, we wore them for the whip walks which were regularly held in those days. I was a real tomboy when I was a kid, but in this outfit I almost felt like a princess. I think my first worry concerning clothes occurred when I moved up into the senior school and I had to wear a uniform. Mum and Dad, they tried very hard to get a grant to cover this expense as they couldn't afford to buy me a uniform, but to no avail. I managed to salvage an old shirt and tie from my older brother who fortunately went to the same school, but I had to make my own skirt and jumper and I was only 11 years old. My brother-in-law had a job emptying dustbins and he'd been put on a round where he had to dispose of rubbish from clothing warehouses in the Manchester city centre. He brought home loads of stuff like bags of sewing threads. In fact, I still use some of them today. Remnants of material and a pile of white bri nylon polo neck jumpers which had been thrown out. Well, I bought a navy blue dye from the shops and used it on one of these jumpers. When it was dry, I cut off the polo neck and cut a V, which I stitched as neatly as I could to make my school jumper. The skirt was just a basic A-line shape, cut out of some material, salvaged from the bags. And there, I had my uniform. And on the first day of term, I stood with all the other new kids, dressed in their navy blue pleated skirts, blazers and satchels. And I think for the very first time in my life, I knew that I looked an absolute mess. But at least I was wearing a uniform. I was still pretty unconcerned about clothes right up to leaving school and starting employment. My wardrobe offered nothing suitable to wear to a real job, so I had to set about making some clothes again. I made 2 A-line skirts, which I wore alternately, and I knitted 2 short sleeveless tops. And because I wore a cardigan over these little tops, I knitted the front in one colour and the back in another colour of wool, so that I could turn them round on different days, and it looked as though I had 4 tops altogether. I was still fairly happy with this situation until I began to notice the male species, and this altered everything. I became very conscious of my appearance, but also began to notice the other women at work and the effect they had on men. Well, television, magazines, advertising hordes, they all shouted out their message, and I realised I just didn't have the image that a girl my age should have. Mini skirts were the order of the day, and it didn't matter what shape you were. If you didn't wear the same as everybody else, then you just weren't with it. Even though I was plump and my legs were the wrong shape, I made myself mini skirts, even going as far as hot pants. And when the cold weather came, I'd wear 2, sometimes even 3 pairs of tights with long boots to fight off the shivers, whilst I relentlessly gave way to fashion. Conformity is a curse which never brings freedom, and while I worked in firms, I always conformed to the image of that particular company. Formal in offices, outrageous in advertising agencies, never really knowing the real me. The beaches presented similar problems, and believe me, I've seen vast changes in swim and beachwear during my lifetime. From all-encompassing swimsuits to bikinis to topless to tiny thongs and back again. These changes are more easily coped with when you're middle-aged or older, but for the young they present enormous pressure, which challenges your morals and your conscience just to see how far you'll go to fit in with what everybody else is doing. Well, I have in the past thought that it was somewhat easier to be different from the world in my speech, readily professing my Christian beliefs, rather than be different in my dress. So why is this? The world has forced us so deceptively and cleverly into its mould that many Christians are afraid to break free and be different in their manner of dress. I suppose it's rather like going on holiday to a foreign country. For a couple of weeks, even months, it's relatively easy to continue to wear your customary dress. But if you decide to live in the community, it's not long before you adopt the dress of everybody around you so that you're accepted into their culture and society. Do we want to be accepted into the worldly culture? Well, for many of us, the answer, even though we wouldn't like to admit it, is yes. I remember many years ago travelling on a plane, and during the flight a man and then his partner walked through the aisle to use the toilets. I was immediately struck by the fact that they were both very obviously Jewish. The man wore black hat and coat and displayed the ringlets and all the rest that goes with it. The woman also stood out to be very orthodox in her dress. And I turned in my mind directly to the scripture in the Bible where God was telling the Israelites that he wanted them to be a peculiar people, different from everybody else in the neighbouring countries, so that all would know by their appearance, regardless of their speech, that they belonged to him. You might think that this is taking scripture too far to consider dressing differently from others in today's world. Nevertheless, it gave me food for thought. When I was pregnant with Nathan, God spoke to Morris and told him that he wanted him to smarten himself up and present himself in a more dignified manner. Prior to this, Morris had considered himself a musician, and as we travelled, we'd take our instruments with us. Morris had 2 bass guitars, I had a keyboard, and I would sing to live backing. In between the songs, Morris would remain seated on his high stool and talk to the congregations or audiences dressed in this frilly or glittery shirt, which I'd made, because he wanted to present the image of being a musician rather than a preacher. But God told him to change his image. This gave us no cause for concern, as being in the ministry, we didn't have any money to buy clothes, so we didn't act immediately. But God meant what he said, and he decided to take the matter into his own hands. During a weekend ministry at a church in the Midlands, the minister asked Maurice to try a suit jacket on. Well, it fitted him perfectly. He then went back upstairs and brought down the accompanying trousers, together with 7 other suits, and gave them to Maurice. Problem solved, or was it? Maurice was still very reluctant to sit on his stool as a musician wearing formal suits. It just didn't look the part. While I was still pregnant and Maurice and I were on holiday, we received a telephone call from someone taking care of our home to say that we'd been robbed and only the musical equipments and PA equipment had been taken, apart from 2 leather jackets which belonged to Maurice. Now this was different. It wasn't only a change of clothes, but it was a change of ministry. It was great for me, as I now sang to backing tapes, which meant that I was relieved of having to lug heavy equipment around with us, which had to be set up and taken down for every meeting. But Maurice had a new job. Now the instruments had been stolen, he was no longer a musician. God was expecting him to preach. I found preparing for a new baby was quite a stressful time. As being in the ministry, I couldn't afford to buy all the things I needed. Maurice would often tell me not to worry because God knew about my needs and would provide everything when the time came. But sometimes I'd resent this situation because I wanted my little baby to have things I'd personally chosen, which were new. You know, on reflection, I'm really glad that God didn't bless or curse us with spare cash, because it's so easy to waste money in this area. Babies and children grow so quickly, changing sizes from month to month, outgrowing clothes, toys, cradles, prams, and so many other things which can cost a small fortune. I didn't have to buy a thing for Nathan, nor for Isaac or Tamar, other than school jumpers and sturdy shoes. And sometimes my children have been given so much good quality, and in some cases designer clothes, that I didn't know what to do with them. God promised Maurice and I once that if we looked after his house, then he would look after ours. And he's fulfilled his side of that promise over and over again. I've also been provided with beautiful clothes, some of which were so elegant and classy that I didn't know who to pass the clothes on to, which didn't fit me. I remember once singing in a young offenders prison. I was walking through the corridors wearing this gorgeous, vivid green cashmere coat with a little black velvet collar, accompanied by a couple of the prisoners who were carrying my PA equipment, when I happened to overhear a couple of the young men talking to each other in a doorway as I passed them. "Hey, the television's here." I wanted to laugh because at that time I really did look the part, and I knew they were serious and very impressed. And God really blessed that night. The kids, after initially showing off and being witty, settled down and became very intent as they listened silently to my message to them from God. I think the thing I've been most blessed with is lack of finance. I know you'll laugh at that, but some people will find this statement impossible to believe. But because I've no personal money of my own, and the money given to our ministry is spent on getting out the message via the internet, books, CDs, etc., we leave God to provide us with everything that we need personally. And I never worry about clothes. I can honestly say that I can take no thought for clothes, because if I'm not worried about keeping up with worldly fashions, I have a good stock of quality, classy, timeless clothes to last me for another 20 years, providing I manage to keep within a certain weight range. God provided fig leaves for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden when there were no clothes available for them to buy. If he was considerate enough to provide for them when they'd plunged the whole world into sin, don't you think he'll care for you? And don't worry, you may not get to choose your clothes for yourself, but I can assure you, you won't be wearing fig leaves. God bless you.